The year 1118 since the Nativity of Christ, Egypt. The barren, sun-scorched Sinai Desert, a land of ancient prophets and wandering trees, had seen much in its time. It remembered the steps of Moses, the clash of Pharaoh's chariots, and the quiet tread of trade caravans laden with spices, silk, and gold. But today its sands were soaking up the sweat and blood of warriors who had come from the distant north. Men of flesh and blood, but driven by an idea that seemed as boundless and indomitable as the very sky above their heads. At the vanguard of this army, on the forward edge of the Christian world, rode a man whose name had already become a legend. He was a king, but not by right of birth in some pampered European capital like Paris or London. He had forged his kingdom with fire and sword, woven it from scraps of conquered lands, will, and pure unbending stubbornness. His name was Baldwin I, by the grace of God, King of Jerusalem. The air was thick with salt and anticipation. Ahead, beyond the last barrier of the desert, lay the goal of his audacious campaign: the Nile Delta, the breadbasket of Egypt, the heart of the weakened but still fabulously wealthy Fatimid Caliphate. The conquest of Egypt would mean not just a triumph. It would be a mortal blow to the chief enemy of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a guarantee of its security for generations to come. It would mean control over the trade routes from India and untold riches capable of making his new state the most powerful in the region. It would be a step that would place him, Baldwin, on a par with the greatest conquerors in history, with Alexander and Caesar. And so he reached the city of Ramla, the key to the Delta. The city fell almost without a fight. Its garrison fled. His warriors, Franks, Normans, Lotharingians, hardened in dozens of battles, feasted amidst the smoking ruins, celebrating victory. The king himself, wishing to perform a symbolic act to show that he had become the master of this land, ordered fish to be brought to him, caught from the great river, from the Nile itself, which his enemies revered as sacred. He sat by a campfire, gazing at the stars, foreign Egyptian stars, and ate this fish, breathing in the air of his almost fulfilled dream. No one, least of all he himself, yet knew that a poison had already taken root in his body. It was not the poison of an enemy, but a treacherous malady exacerbated by an old wound in the hardships of the campaign. No one suspected that this triumphal feast on the banks of the Nile would be his last meal, and that the greatest of his campaigns would be his road to death. At this moment, at the peak of his power, on the verge of fulfilling his boldest design, the threads of Baldwin I's fate were already weaving into a tight knot, preparing to snap and plunge the state he had created into the chaos of uncertainty. To understand the greatness and tragedy of this moment, we must go back to the misty lands of northern Europe, where in the gloom of a medieval castle the life of a boy began, who was not destined to inherit a single foot of his father's land, but who was foreordained to conquer a sacred throne. Before we delve into the history of the great king's making, it is necessary to understand the world that produced him. Europe at the end of the 11th century was a seething cauldron. It was an era when the old orders were creaking at the seams and new ones were only just forcing their way through. It was a time of great upheavals and great opportunities. In the north, the Norman conquerors had not yet fully digested a captured England, and were creating new kingdoms in southern Italy. In the south, in Spain, the Reconquista was in full swing, the slow and bloody reconquest of lands from the Muslims. In the very heart of Europe, in the Holy Roman Empire, the investiture controversy was raging, a fundamental conflict between popes and emperors for the right to appoint bishops, and in essence, for supreme authority in the Christian world. It was a time of the deepest, almost fanatical religiosity, where the will of the Lord was seen in every lightning strike and every gust of wind. But it was also a time of the harshest pragmatism, where land was the ultimate value and the sword was the ultimate argument. At the heart of this world's social structure lay a seemingly unshakable principle: the right of primogeniture or majorat. Its essence was simple and cruel. The eldest son inherited everything: the castle, the lands, the title, the vassals. He became the head of the family, the continuer of the dynasty. For the younger sons, the choice was unenviable. The first path was the church. For the scion of a noble family, this was a perfectly worthy lot. One could become the abbot of a wealthy monastery, an influential bishop, or even, with enough luck and patronage, a cardinal. A career in the church offered power, honor, wealth, and not unimportantly security. But it required the renunciation of worldly life, of marriage, of the opportunity to found one's own dynasty. It was a path of service to God, but for many it was a path of self-denial. The second path was the sword. A younger son could become a knight in the service of his elder brother or another powerful lord. He could seek glory and booty in countless tournaments, which in that era were not so much a sport as a brutal imitation of war, and in the feudal wars that constantly broke out across Europe. He could hope that for faithful service, he would be granted a small fief, that is, a piece of land with a few villages. Or by marrying a wealthy heiress, he could become a lord himself. But there were not enough heiresses for everyone, and service was dangerous and often thankless. Many of these landless knights turned into vagabonds, mercenaries, and sometimes simply noble robbers, forming bands and terrorizing the countryside. They were a surplus but extremely active product of the feudal system, a restless, ambitious, and perpetually hungry element ready to go anywhere in search of land and glory. It was into this world, into this system of coordinates, around the year 1060 in the county of Bouillon on the coast of the English Channel, that a boy named Baldwin was born. He was the youngest of 3 sons of Count Eustace II of Boulogne, a famous companion of William the Conqueror, and his wife, Arda of Lorraine, a woman of high birth famed for her piety. His elder brothers, Eustace III and Godfrey of Bouillon, were born for the world. Eustace was to inherit his father's county of Boulogne. Godfrey, by his mother's right, received the vast and wealthy duchy of Lower Lorraine, making him one of the most powerful lords in the Holy Roman Empire. For Baldwin, the third son, nothing was left. His lot was predetermined from the cradle, a spiritual career. Baldwin's family was a nexus of power and influence in northwestern Europe. His father, Eustace II, had not only fought at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, he was one of William's key companions, receiving vast estates in England for his service. He was a man of his time, warlike, ambitious, not averse to intrigue, later even attempting to rebel against the conqueror. His mother, Arda, was his complete opposite. Recognized by the Catholic Church as blessed, she was known for her piety, charity, and for founding several monasteries. She corresponded with Anselm of Canterbury himself, one of the greatest theologians of the age. It was she, probably, who insisted that her youngest son, the one most gifted in studies, should dedicate himself to the service of the Lord. Baldwin's childhood and youth were spent in the shadow of cathedrals and in the silence of monastery libraries. He studied Latin, Holy Scripture, the works of the Church Fathers, as well as the basics of the 7 liberal arts, namely grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. He became a canon in the cathedrals of Cambrai, Reims, and Liège. A canon is not a monk living in strict seclusion. He is a member of a cathedral chapter, receiving income from church lands or benefices, and participating in the governance of the diocese. A brilliant ecclesiastical career lay before him. He was intelligent, educated, and came from the noblest of families. The path to a bishop's mitre or even a cardinal's hat seemed straight and clear. But what was happening in this young man's soul? Did the quiet life of a cleric suit his nature? Looking at his elder brothers clad in armor, riding at the head of bands of vassals, did he not feel a pang of envy? Did he not dream of his own glory, of the clash of swords, of his own castle and lands? The sources are silent on this, but his entire subsequent life would be a resounding answer to these questions. By 1086, when he was already about 25, Baldwin suddenly and decisively broke with his predestined fate. He, as the chronicles say, cast off his cassock, renounced his church benefices, and declared himself a knight. This act was scandalous and daring. It meant a break with the will of his family, especially his pious mother. It closed the doors to one of the most influential corporations of the Middle Ages. But it also opened another door to a world of danger, adventure, and limitless possibilities. Baldwin left for Normandy, to the court of the powerful Robert Curthose, son of William the Conqueror. There, he married a noble Anglo-Norman lady named Godehilde de Tony, the daughter of Ralph de Tony, an influential baron whose domains stretched across both sides of the Channel. This marriage introduced him to the highest circles of the Norman aristocracy, but he remained a landless knight, a vassal of his brother Godfrey in his domains in Verdun. His position was precarious. He was educated, intelligent, ambitious, but dependent. He was a prince without a kingdom, an eagle with clipped wings waiting for his moment. And that moment was near. It was to strike not in the quiet valleys of Lorraine or in the intrigues of the Norman court, but under the scorching sun of the East, towards which the eyes of the entire Christian world would soon turn. It seemed the world was frozen in a fragile balance, but beneath the surface forces were maturing, ready to shatter this order, and soon the thunder would strike. On November 27th, 1095, in the small French town of Clermont, an event occurred that was destined to shake the foundations of the world and direct the energy of thousands like Baldwin into a single devastating channel. Pope Urban II, ascending a specially built platform before a huge crowd of knights, priests, and commoners, delivered a speech that would perhaps become the most influential in human history. He spoke of the sufferings of Christians in the East. He painted vivid pictures of desecrated holy sites, of the humiliations and torments to which pilgrims were subjected on their way to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He spoke of the Seljuk Turks, who had come from the depths of Asia, who a few decades earlier had crushed the Byzantine army at Manzikert in 1071, had conquered almost all of Anatolia, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, and were now threatening Constantinople itself. He appealed to the pride of the Franks, calling them a chosen people, destined to liberate their brothers in faith. But his speech was not just a call to compassion. It was a brilliant political move. The Pope offered a solution to one of the most acute problems of contemporary Europe, the problem of surplus knights, those same younger sons who, having no land, brought only war and ruin. And here it is necessary to make an important digression to understand why this call found such a powerful response at this particular moment. The enemy against whom Urban was calling to fight, that is, the Seljuk world, was far from united and monolithic. The great Seljuk Empire, stretching from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, had reached its peak under Sultan Malik Shah I. However, his death in 1092 plunged this vast state into a whirlpool of internecine strife. His sons, brothers, and nephews immediately began a fierce struggle for the inheritance. The unified empire effectively disintegrated into several warring states. The Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia under Kilij Arslan, emirates in Syria ruled by rival brothers Ridwan in Aleppo and Dukak in Damascus, and the powerful but distant Atabeg of Mosul, Kerboga. Each local ruler was more concerned with fighting his rival neighbors than with some mythical threat from the West. This was a unique moment of political vacuum and fragmentation in the Islamic world of the Near East. The Crusaders, without knowing it, were about to strike an enemy that was weakened and incapable of offering a unified resistance. Urban II may not have known all the subtleties, but he certainly knew that Byzantium was weak and the Turks were busy with their own quarrels. The moment was chosen perfectly. Pope Urban II addressed the knights directly, saying, "Let your quarrels cease, let controversies be silenced, let wars stop and all discord and fighting sleep. Enter upon the road into the Holy Sepulchre. Wrest that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves. That land which, as the scripture says, floweth with milk and honey. Jerusalem is the navel of the world, the land fruitful above all others, like another paradise of delights." This was a call that hit the mark precisely. It offered land to the landless. The greatest of feats to those seeking glory, full remission of sins, and indulgence for participation in a holy war to sinners. To all who felt superfluous in old Europe, he pointed a new way, a new goal consecrated by the will of God himself. The idea of a holy war, of a pilgrimage armed, fell on fertile ground. The cry Deus vult, which means God wills it, taken up by thousands of voices, swept over the fields of Clermont and echoed in all corners of the Christian world. For the brothers Baldwin, Godfrey, and Eustace, this call became a matter of honor and faith. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, was a deeply religious man, but also an experienced warrior and ruler. He immediately responded to the Pope's call and began to assemble an army. Eustace III, Count of Boulogne, followed his example. And what of Baldwin? Was his impulse so pious? The chroniclers, especially those who wrote later and knew of his subsequent fate, expressed doubts. William of Tyre, the chief historian of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, who lived almost a century later, subtly hints that Baldwin was driven not so much by faith as by ambition. He saw in the crusade the one chance that fate offers once in a lifetime, a chance to break free from the shadow of his powerful brothers, a chance to conquer his own domain, a chance to become someone. Preparing for the crusade required enormous funds. A knight needed to equip not only himself, including a war horse, armor, and weapons, but also his retinue of squires and servants, and to provide them with provisions for months of travel. Godfrey, to raise money, sold and mortgaged a significant part of his domains, including the castle of Bouillon, which he sold to the Bishop of Liège and which gave him his famous nickname. Baldwin, having no lands of his own to sell, set out on the crusade with his brother. He took with him his wife Godehilda and their young children. This fact speaks volumes. He was not just going on a military expedition, he was emigrating. He was burning all his bridges, staking everything on this grandiose enterprise. He did not intend to return. In the summer of 1096, the huge army assembled by Godfrey and Baldwin set out. This was not just a mob of fanatics like the so-called People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, which had passed through a little earlier and was ignominiously destroyed by the Turks. It was an organized feudal army consisting of knights from Lorraine, Wallonia, Flanders, and northern France. Their path lay through Germany, Hungary, and the Balkans to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, where they were to meet the other leaders of the Crusade, the powerful and wealthy Raymond of Toulouse, the cunning Bohemond of Taranto, and his nephew, the young and fierce Tancred. The journey was long and difficult. It required not only military valor but also diplomatic skill. Particularly difficult were the negotiations with King Coloman, the Learned of Hungary, who was very suspicious of the armed crowds passing through his lands, remembering the outrages and looting of the peasant host. It was here that Baldwin first proved himself a skilled diplomat. To guarantee the army's peaceful passage, the Hungarian king demanded a hostage of the highest rank, and this hostage was Baldwin himself, along with his family. He risked his freedom and the lives of his loved ones for the success of the common cause. When the army had safely passed through Hungarian lands, he was released. This episode showed the other leaders that Godfrey's younger brother was not just one of many knights in the Duke's retinue, but an independent figure, a man capable of decisive action and personal sacrifice. He arrived in Constantinople no longer as an unknown cleric who had cast off his cassock, but as one of the notable participants in the Great Crusade, whose reputation was beginning to precede him. Constantinople. At the end of the 11th century, this city was not just a capital. It was the center of the world, the heir of Rome, the greatest metropolis of Christian civilization. Its golden domes, marble palaces, colossal walls, aqueducts, hippodrome, and untold riches gathered from all over the world made a stunning impression on the Crusaders, who were accustomed to their gloomy and cramped castles. But this city was also the center of the most complex political intrigues. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who had asked the West for help against the Turks, now looked with horror upon the huge, poorly managed armies crowded at the walls of his capital. He had expected a detachment of mercenaries, but he got a whole migration of peoples led by ambitious and independent barons. Alexios was a master of Byzantine diplomacy, subtle, devious, and not always honest. His main goal was to force the Crusader leaders to take an oath of vassalage to him, and to promise to return to the empire all the lands they would reconquer from the Turks. The leaders, each of whom considered himself a sovereign ruler, resisted. A long and, for the proud Frankish barons, humiliating bargaining began. Alexios used all means: flattery, bribery, threats, displays of military power, and even temporarily cutting off food supplies. Godfrey, as the most noble, long refused but eventually yielded. Baldwin, following his brother's example, also took the oath of allegiance to the emperor. But an atmosphere of distrust had already arisen, and would not disappear until the very end. Here, under the walls of Constantinople, the rivalry that was to become one of the leitmotifs of the early history of the Crusader states first became clearly apparent. This was the rivalry between Baldwin and Tancred of Taranto. Tancred was the nephew of Bohemond, the Italo-Norman prince, a sworn enemy of Byzantium. Like Baldwin, he was a younger scion of a noble house, landless but boiling with ambition. He was brave to the point of recklessness, proud and uncompromising. He was the only one of the major leaders who demonstratively refused to swear allegiance to the Byzantine emperor. Crossing the Bosphorus secretly under the cover of night, in the eyes of many he looked like a true, uncompromising warrior of Christ, while others, including Baldwin, had made a deal. In the spring of 1097, the combined Crusader army ferried by the Byzantines to Asia besieged Nicaea, the first capital of the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. The siege was long and bloody. Baldwin and Tancred fought side by side, but their paths were soon to diverge after the fall of Nicaea, which the Byzantines cunningly took under their control by negotiating with the garrison behind the Franks' backs and depriving them of booty, which caused a new outburst of indignation. The army moved deeper into enemy territory. At the Battle of Dorylaeum, the Crusaders won a brilliant victory over the superior forces of Sultan Kilij Arslan Verge. But the subsequent journey across the arid and scorched Anatolian plateau turned into a living hell. Men and horses died of thirst and hunger. It was on this grueling march that Baldwin's wife, Godehilda, and their children died. The death of his family became a turning point for Baldwin. It severed the last thread connecting him to his past life. Now he was completely free and completely alone. He had nothing but his sword, his armor, and an insatiable thirst for power. Perhaps it was at this moment that he finally decided that his path did not lie to Jerusalem, or at least not to Gautan Suligasut. Directly to Jerusalem. While the main army, slowly and painfully, crept southwards towards Antioch, Baldwin saw his chance. In September of 1097, when the Crusaders reached Heraclea, Baldwin, along with Tancred and a small detachment, separated from the main army. Their stated goal was reconnaissance and foraging in the fertile lands of Cilicia, an ancient region on the southeastern coast of Asia Minor. But the true motives of both were far more prosaic. They went in search of their own principality. Cilicia at that moment was a colorful tapestry of Armenian principalities, Byzantine garrisons, and Turkish fortresses. The local Armenian population, being Christians, though not Catholics, generally welcomed the Crusaders as liberators from Turkish rule. It was here in Cilicia that the first open clash between Baldwin and Tancred occurred. Both of them had set their sights on the rich port city of Tarsus, the birthplace of the Apostle Paul. Tancred, with a detachment of 100 knights, arrived first. The local Turkish garrison, seeing the approach of the Franks and fearing an uprising of the Armenian population, agreed to surrender the city to Tancred. He raised his banner over the fortress. However, the next day Baldwin approached Tarsus with a much larger detachment of 300 knights. What happened next is described differently by the sources, but the essence is clear. Baldwin, relying on his numerical superiority and perhaps on the dissatisfaction of the Armenian townspeople with Tancred's Italo-Normans, effectively squeezed him out of the city. He convinced the townspeople that he, as the brother of a powerful duke and a man who had sworn allegiance to the emperor, was a more reliable protector. An ugly scene occurred when Baldwin's men tore down Tancred's banner, and some of his knights left in the city were killed or expelled by the townspeople incited by Baldwin's supporters. The enraged Tancred was forced to retreat and seek other prey. The conflict nearly escalated into an open battle. This incident at Tarsus became the first apple of discord. It showed that for these men, the thirst for power and personal ambitions were sometimes stronger than the idea of brotherhood in Christ. Baldwin acted cynically, harshly, and effectively. He had gotten his first city, but Tarsus was just a stepping stone. His gaze was already turned further east, to where rumors were coming of an even richer and more important city that was looking for a strong patron. And while the main forces of the Crusaders were bogged down in the arduous months-long siege of Antioch in the east, beyond the Euphrates River, a drama was unfolding that would provide Baldwin with his main chance. There, in the upper reaches of Mesopotamia, lay the ancient principality of Edessa. Edessa was a city with a most rich history. According to tradition, it was here that the Apostle Thaddeus brought Christianity, and the local king, Abgar V, corresponded with Jesus Christ himself. The city was considered the guardian of one of the greatest relics, the Mandylion, or the image of Edessa, a cloth with the image of Christ's face. The population of Edessa and its surroundings was predominantly Armenian and Syriac Orthodox, that is, Christian, but power in the city belonged to an Orthodox Armenian prince named Thoros, a former Byzantine official. Thoros's position was desperate. He was caught as if in a vice. On one side, he was threatened by the powerful Muslim emirs of Mosul and Aleppo, notably Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, who was assembling a huge army. On the other, he was disliked by his own Armenian population, who considered him a foreigner, a Byzantine puppet, and a Chalcedonian heretic. He desperately needed a strong ally, a military force capable of protecting him from the Turks. And the appearance of the Frankish armies in the west seemed to him like divine providence. When rumors of Baldwin's exploits in Cilicia, of his capture of Tarsus and Mamistra, reached him, Thoros saw him as his savior. He sent envoys to Baldwin with an incredible offer. He invited Baldwin to become his mercenary and protector. But more importantly, being childless, he offered to adopt him and make him his heir. For Baldwin, this was an offer he could not refuse. Edessa was not just a city. It was a rich center of caravan trade, a strategic outpost controlling the Euphrates crossings and the routes from Asia Minor to Persia and Mesopotamia. To become the ruler of Edessa meant to get what he could not even have dreamed of: his own sovereign state. In February of 1098, leaving a small garrison in the Cilician cities he had captured, Baldwin, with a detachment of about 80 knights, set out for Edessa. His arrival in the city was staged with maximum pomp. The population, exhausted by the threat of Turkish raids, greeted him as a liberator. Prince Thoros held feasts and celebrations in his honor. Soon the adoption ceremony took place. It was a strange, semi-pagan ritual described by the chroniclers. Baldwin and Thoros, both naked to the waist, were seated under one wide shirt, thus symbolizing that they were becoming one, father and son. A similar ritual was performed by Thoros's wife. From that moment, Baldwin officially became co-ruler and heir of Edessa. However, it soon became clear that Baldwin's ambitions extended far beyond the role of an adopted son and assistant. He quickly assessed the situation. He saw Thoros's unpopularity among the Armenian nobility and townspeople. He felt that real power was slipping from the old prince's hands and coming into his own. What happened next is one of the darkest and most controversial episodes in his biography. A few weeks after the adoption, a rebellion against Thoros broke out in Edessa. The townspeople besieged him in the citadel. Baldwin's own role in this rebellion is not entirely clear. Did he directly incite the conspirators, or did he simply take a wait-and-see approach, understanding that events were developing in his favor? Most historians are inclined to believe that if he was not the organizer, he at least tacitly encouraged the rebellion and did nothing to save his adoptive father. Thoros, seeing that his position was hopeless, promised to surrender the citadel in exchange for guarantees of free passage to Melitene. Baldwin gave him such guarantees, but when, on the next day, March 9th, 1098, Thoros tried to leave the castle, the mob seized him, subjected him to cruel torture, and killed him. His body was displayed for all to see. Baldwin, who had sworn to protect him, did not lift a finger. The next day, March 10th, he was proclaimed the new ruler of Edessa. The chronicles report that he took the title of count, although in essence he became a fully fledged prince. Thus the landless younger son of the Count of Bouillon, a former cleric who had gone to the Holy Land to liberate the Holy Sepulchre, became the first ruler of the First Crusader state in the East. He had achieved his goal. But the price was high. His rise to power was marred by the betrayal and murder of a man who had trusted him. This act would forever leave a dark stain on his reputation. But for Baldwin himself, it was probably just a necessary step on the path to greatness. He was a pragmatist to the core. He had set a precedent. Henceforth, the Crusaders came to the East not only as pilgrims and liberators, but also as conquerors, ready to create their own states, even if it meant making alliances with local rulers and then betraying them. The county of Edessa, created by Baldwin, would for half a century be the northern shield of the Latin East, the first bastion of the Christian world in a hostile land. Having become the ruler of Edessa, Baldwin immediately faced a huge number of problems. His domain was an island in a Muslim sea. His contingent consisted of only a few dozen knights. The population, though mostly Christian, consisted of Armenians and Syrians who looked upon the foreign Franks with distrust and apprehension. Baldwin had not just to hold on to power, but to build a fully fledged state from scratch. And here his talents, not as a warrior but as an administrator and politician, were fully revealed. First of all, he set about strengthening his position. He understood that brute force would not help in his situation. He needed to find common ground with the local elite, and he took the most reasonable and pragmatic step. He decided to marry into it. Baldwin married Arda, the daughter of a powerful Armenian prince, Tatul or Thoros, a namesake of the murdered ruler of Edessa from Marash. This marriage was purely a political calculation. It gave Baldwin not only a huge dowry of 60,000 gold bezants, but more importantly, legitimacy in the eyes of the Armenian population. He ceased to be just a Frankish adventurer. He became one of them, the son-in-law of one of their princes. This alliance allowed him to recruit Armenian warriors and officials into his service, without whom governing the county would have been impossible. Next, Baldwin began to methodically expand and strengthen the borders of his new state. He waged constant wars with minor Muslim emirs and Turkish garrisons in neighboring fortresses. He acted like a predator, sometimes by force, sometimes by cunning, sometimes by bribery. He captured one town after another, annexing Samosata, Birachik, and other important points controlling the Euphrates crossings to Edessa. He combined reckless bravery. He more than once charged with a handful of knights against superior enemy forces with cold calculation. He did not shy away from making temporary alliances with some Muslim rulers against others, playing on their internal contradictions. His rule in Edessa was also a time of active social and economic construction. He encouraged the settlement of depopulated lands by Frankish colonists, but at the same time preserved the rights and privileges of the local population. Unlike many other crusaders who looked down on Eastern Christians as heretics, Baldwin treated them as valuable subjects. He established a fair tax system and organized the collection of duties from caravans passing through his lands, which brought a stable income to the treasury. He was a stern but not a cruel ruler. His Armenian subjects, though they did not have a great love for him, respected him for bringing relative peace and order to their land, protecting them from Turkish raids. While Baldwin was building his county, the main Crusader forces, after a bloody siege, took Antioch, and then, in 1099, made a final push and captured Jerusalem. The dream, it seemed, had come true. The Holy Sepulchre was liberated, but immediately the question arose what to do next. Who would rule the Holy City? After long disputes, Baldwin's brother, Godfrey of Bouillon, was elected ruler. However, in a fit of piety, he refused to accept a royal crown in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns and contented himself with the modest title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. Baldwin, upon learning of these events, visited his brother in Jerusalem. He brought reinforcements and helped Godfrey in several military campaigns. But he did not stay in the Holy City. His own state, his Edessa, required his presence. He returned across the Euphrates to continue his work. Perhaps even then he sensed that Godfrey's fragile health and his reluctance to accept the royal title opened up new, even more dizzying prospects for him. In May of 1100, an event that became a catastrophe for the Crusader East occurred. At the Battle of Haran, the combined army of the county of Edessa and the Principality of Antioch suffered a crushing defeat by the Turks. Baldwin of Edessa himself, not our hero but his cousin and namesake Baldwin of Bourg, to whom he had temporarily transferred the county's governance, was captured. Our Baldwin did not participate in this battle, but the defeat at Haran showed how vulnerable the young Crusader states were. And just 2 months later, on July 18th, 1100, Godfrey of Bouillon, advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, died of illness in Jerusalem. The death of Godfrey of Bouillon plunged the young kingdom of Jerusalem into a deep crisis. The state, barely established, was left without a ruler, and a fierce struggle for power immediately began. The main contenders for the throne were two powerful factions. The first was led by Dagobert of Pisa, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. This man was ambitious, power-hungry, and fanatical. He dreamed of turning the kingdom of Jerusalem into a theocratic state under the direct rule of the Church, or rather under his personal rule like the Papal States in Italy. He argued that since Godfrey was only an advocate, after his death all power should pass to him, God's representative on earth. He was supported by the Italo-Norman knights led by Tancred, who had by then become Prince of Galilee and Baldwin's old enemy. Tancred and Dagobert wanted to see Bohemond of Taranto, Tancred's uncle and Prince of Antioch, on the throne. But Bohemond, by a twist of fate, had shortly before been captured by the Muslims himself. Dagobert's plan was simple. While Bohemond was in captivity, he would rule alone, and Tancred would be his main military support. The second faction consisted of knights from Lorraine and northern France, the loyal companions of the late Godfrey. They understood perfectly well that Dagobert's theocracy would lead the kingdom to ruin. The state, surrounded by enemies, needed a strong secular ruler, a warrior capable of leading an army, and they saw the only worthy candidate in the person of their late lord's own brother, Baldwin, Count of Edessa. Messengers were immediately sent to Edessa with news of Godfrey's death, and a call to come to Jerusalem immediately and accept the crown. For Baldwin, this was the moment of truth. He did not hesitate for a second, leaving the county of Edessa to his cousin Baldwin of Bourg, the same one who had recently returned from captivity. He, with a detachment of only 200 knights and about 700 infantrymen, immediately set out. The journey from Edessa to Jerusalem was extremely dangerous. It passed through territories controlled by Muslim emirs, who were well aware of Godfrey's death and of who was coming to succeed him. Dukak, the emir of Damascus, set an ambush for him at the Nahr al-Kalb, or Dog River, not far from Beirut. Here Baldwin displayed all his best qualities: personal courage, tactical cunning, and composure. Despite the enemy's huge numerical superiority, he did not evade battle. He formed his warriors into a dense formation and withstood several attacks. At a critical moment, he personally led a counterattack that put the Muslims to flight. This victory, won against superior forces, made a huge impression on both enemies and comrades. Rumors of it flew ahead of him. He entered Jerusalem not just as the late ruler's brother, but as a hero, a victor, a man led by fate itself. His arrival in the Holy City in early November of 1100 threw Dagobert's and Tancred's plans into disarray. Tancred, realizing he had lost, tried to hinder Baldwin by capturing several castles on his way, but was forced to retreat. Dagobert, seeing the determination of the Lotharingian party and Baldwin's popularity, was forced to back down. He locked himself in the citadel of the Tower of David and refused to hand it over to the new ruler. A standoff began. Baldwin did not storm the citadel. He simply began to wait, and time was on his side. The Patriarch's support was melting away with each passing day. In the end, Dagobert was forced to surrender and conclude a compromise agreement with Baldwin. One last question remained: the coronation. Baldwin, unlike his pious brother, had no doubts. He had come to be king. He was not going to be content with the title of advocate. He wanted to found a dynasty, to create a fully fledged hereditary kingdom. Patriarch Dagobert, still hoping to retain his influence, refused to crown him in Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He cited Godfrey's example and the sanctity of the place. Baldwin was not deterred. If he could not be crowned in Jerusalem, he would be crowned in another no less holy place on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1100, in the Basilica of the Nativity in Bethlehem, where, according to tradition, the Savior was born. Baldwin, Count of Edessa, was solemnly crowned as the first king of Jerusalem. The crown was placed on his head not by Dagobert, but by the Archbishop of Bethlehem. This act was full of symbolism. It marked the birth of a new kingdom, secular, feudal, built on the Western model. Baldwin I became its founder and architect. Before him lay a titanic task: to turn a handful of scattered conquests inhabited by warring factions into a viable state. Ascending the throne, Baldwin III inherited a very shaky domain. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the year 1100 was a thin strip of land running from Jaffa to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, with a separate enclave in Galilee. The entire Mediterranean coast, with the exception of the port of Jaffa, was in the hands of Fatimid Egypt. This was mortally dangerous. Firstly, without ports, the kingdom was cut off from Europe, from the influx of new pilgrims, warriors, and goods. Secondly, the Egyptian garrisons in coastal cities such as Arsuf, Caesarea, Acre, Sidon, Beirut, and Tyre were a constant threat, a springboard for invasions. Baldwin understood perfectly well that task number one was the conquest of the coast, but his own army was pitifully small. It is estimated that he could field no more than a few hundred knights and a couple of thousand infantrymen. With such forces, storming powerful coastal fortresses was impossible. He needed a fleet, and the fleet in the Mediterranean at that time was possessed only by the Italian merchant republics, Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. And Baldwin, as a true pragmatist, began to negotiate with them. The scheme he offered the Italians was simple and brilliant. He offered them not just payment for military aid, he offered them a share in the future conquest. When a Genoese, Venetian, or Pisan fleet approached the walls of a Muslim city and blockaded it from the sea, Baldwin's army would besiege it from the land. After the city was taken, the Italians would receive an entire quarter in full ownership, trade privileges, exemption from duties, and their own church. This was an incredibly profitable offer. The Italians received permanent and protected trading posts in the east, and Baldwin got the fleet necessary to expand his kingdom. Thus began a methodical step-by-step campaign to conquer the coast. In 1101, with the help of the Genoese fleet, Baldwin captured Arsuf and Caesarea. In 1104, Acre fell, a huge strategic success that turned the city into the main sea gate of the kingdom. In 1110, with the help of the fleet of the Norwegian king Sigurd the Crusader, Sidon was taken. By the end of his reign, Baldwin controlled almost the entire coastline from the Egyptian border to Beirut. Only Tyre and Ascalon remained unconquered. However, conquering the ports was only one side of the coin. The other, no less important, was defending the existing lands from constant raids. From the south threatened Egypt, and from the east, Damascus. To control these directions, Baldwin began to implement a large-scale construction program. He did not just fortify existing cities, he built new castles in key strategic points. His main achievement in this area was the creation of the Lordship of Oultrejordain, which stretched east of the Dead Sea. This territory was vitally important. Through it passed caravan and pilgrimage routes from Syria to Egypt and Arabia. By controlling them, Baldwin could not only levy tolls but also intercept enemy armies and communications. In 1115, during an expedition to the Gulf of Aqaba, he founded the kingdom's southernmost outpost there, and on his way back, he founded the castle of Crac de Montreal. This castle, built on a hilltop, dominated the entire surrounding area and became the administrative center of the new domain. Such castles were not just military bases. They were centers of colonization and economic control. The lord of such a castle governed the surrounding lands, collected taxes from the settled and nomadic populations, protected the farmers, and provided work for artisans. The construction of such castles was a demonstration of strength and long-term vision. Baldwin was not just repelling attacks, he was digging into the land, creating a stone skeleton for his kingdom that was meant to last for centuries. But who served in the army that defended these castles and cities? The royal army was a complex organism reflecting Baldwin's pragmatism. The core, of course, consisted of Frankish knights, that is, vassals of the king and major barons, obliged to perform military service for their lands. But there were few of them. A much larger part of the army consisted of sergeants, that is, professional soldiers mounted or on foot, who did not have knightly status but were well armed and trained. And the most interesting and indicative innovation was the Turcopoles. These were detachments of light cavalry recruited from the local population, for example, from converted Turks, Arabs, or even Syrians. Armed with bows and light spears, they operated on the model of Muslim cavalry, conducting reconnaissance, making raids, and covering the flanks of the heavy knightly cavalry. The inclusion of Turcopoles in the army was a brilliant move. Baldwin used the enemy's strengths against the enemy himself, demonstrating a flexibility and readiness to learn from the foe that was surprising for that era. No less important was the defense against annual Egyptian invasions. The main battlefield became the plain around the city of Ramla. Here in 1101, 1102, and 1105, 3 bloody battles took place. In these battles, 2 completely different military doctrines clashed. The strength of the Crusaders lay in their heavy knightly cavalry. The combined charging impact of armored knights armed with long lances was practically unstoppable for any infantry of that time. The Fatimid army, on the contrary, relied on numerical superiority and a variety of troops. The core was sturdy Sudanese infantry, the flanks were covered by light Arab and Berber cavalry, and the strike force was detachments of Turkish horse archers or Mamluks. In the First Battle of Ramla in September 1101, Baldwin, with only 260 knights, dared to attack an army that outnumbered him tens of times over, and miraculously won. But in 1102, in the second battle, his small army was almost annihilated by superior Egyptian forces. Baldwin himself miraculously escaped capture or death by taking refuge in the Tower of Ramla, and then fleeing under cover of night. This episode, which became legendary, showed that even in the face of catastrophic defeat, the king did not lose his composure. He managed to reach Arsuf, gather a new detachment, and save the kingdom. These battles, though extremely risky, halted the Egyptian offensive and for several years provided the kingdom with relative security from the south. Baldwin had proved that his small kingdom could defend itself. In addition to wars and conquests, Baldwin had to solve no less complex internal problems. He needed to create a working system of government, suppress opposition, settle empty lands, and establish relations with the powerful church. His main opponent in the early years of his reign remained Patriarch Dagobert of Pisa. Their conflict was not just a struggle of 2 personalities, it was a clash of 2 models of statehood, secular monarchy and theocracy. Baldwin methodically undermined the Patriarch's position. In 1102, he managed to have him deposed with the help of a papal legate, accusing Dagobert of various transgressions, including embezzlement of church funds. More loyal hierarchs were appointed in his place. Baldwin achieved his goal. The church in the Kingdom of Jerusalem became rich and influential, but it was subordinate to the royal power, not the other way around. The king, not the patriarch, became the supreme ruler. Another crucial task was to increase the Christian population. After the conquest of Jerusalem and the massacre carried out by the Crusaders, the city and its surroundings were depopulated. Muslims and Jews were either killed or expelled. The kingdom needed new subjects, farmers, artisans, merchants. Baldwin began an active policy of attracting colonists. He invited Christians from the West, promising them land and privileges. But even more important was his patronage of local Eastern Christians such as Syrians, Armenians, and Maronites, whom the Crusaders initially treated as heretics. Baldwin understood their value. He allowed them to resettle in Jerusalem, to live in the deserted quarters, and to engage in trade and crafts. It was under him that the unique society of the Latin East began to form, where Frankish feudal lords ruled over a motley conglomerate of peoples and faiths. How did this work in practice? Baldwin and his barons quickly realized that directly managing every village was impossible and unprofitable. They created a system based on pragmatism. Frankish feudal lords were subject to their own laws, which would later form the basis of the famous Assizes of Jerusalem. And local communities, both Christian and Muslim, retained a significant degree of self-government. Each village had its own headman, or rais, who was the intermediary between the inhabitants and the Frankish lord. The rais was responsible for collecting taxes, settling internal disputes, and representing the community's interests. The Frankish lord, often living in his castle, was primarily interested in the timely payment of a share of the harvest or a monetary tax. In other respects, village life flowed according to its age-old laws. Muslims, though considered second-class subjects, retained their faith, property, and in most cases their land, paying a tax similar to the jizya. This was not a system of integration, but rather a system of coexisting parallel societies. This approach, dictated by the Franks' shortage of manpower, proved surprisingly effective and provided the kingdom with relative internal stability for decades to come. The king's life was not without high-profile personal scandals which shed light on his pragmatic and sometimes cynical nature. His marriage to the Armenian princess Arda, contracted in Edessa, proved short-lived. After Baldwin became king and gained access to the kingdom's wealth, the need for Arda's dowry and the political support of her Armenian relatives disappeared. He began to tire of his wife. Around 1108, he accused her of infidelity, most likely baselessly, and forced her into a convent. This act caused grumbling among some of the clergy and soured his relations with the Armenian community. But Baldwin cared little. He was free for a new, more advantageous marriage, and such a marriage was not long in coming. In 1113, Baldwin married for the third time. His chosen bride was Adelaide del Vasto, the very wealthy widow of Roger I, Count of Sicily, and regent for her young son, the future King Roger II. This marriage was a deal, pure and simple. Adelaide brought with her to Jerusalem immense wealth, such as gold, silver, detachments of warriors, and even Muslim archer bodyguards. This money was desperately needed by Baldwin to pay off debts and maintain his army. For her part, Adelaide received a royal title and the prestigious status of Queen of Jerusalem. However, there was one scandalous clause in the marriage contract. If the marriage of Baldwin and Adelaide proved childless, the heir to the Jerusalem throne was to be Adelaide's son from her first marriage, Roger of Sicily. This was a direct violation of the feudal laws of inheritance. Baldwin had legitimate heirs, his nephew Eustace III of Boulogne and his cousin Baldwin of Bourg, to whom he had given Edessa. The promise to pass the crown to a foreign Sicilian prince caused great discontent among the kingdom's nobility. But Baldwin, needing money, went through with the deal. However, the marriage with Adelaide also produced no children, and a few years later, in 1117, when the kingdom's financial situation had improved and the political necessity of an alliance with Sicily had passed, Baldwin committed another cynical act. Under pressure from the clergy and nobility, and perhaps at the behest of his own conscience or, more likely, political calculation, he declared his marriage to Adelaide invalid. The formal pretext was that at the time of the marriage, his previous wife Arda was still alive, meaning he was a bigamist. The insulted and robbed Adelaide was forced to return to Sicily in disgrace. The consequences of this act would haunt the kingdom of Jerusalem for a long time. The offended house of the kings of Sicily would for many years be hostile to Jerusalem and would refuse it aid. Baldwin, for his part, had once again shown that for him, state interests, or how he understood them, were above any personal obligations, oaths, or moral norms. By 1118, Baldwin III had reached the peak of his power. He had ruled for 18 years. During these years, he had transformed his brother's ghostly domain into a strong, territorially defined, centralized feudal state. He had conquered the coast, repelled dozens of invasions, built castles, established an administration, and subjugated the church. But he had no intention of stopping there. His gaze was fixed on the main enemy, the source of constant threat, Egypt. In early 1118, despite his deteriorating health, He was troubled by an old wound received several years earlier. Baldwin assembled an army for his most ambitious campaign. He decided to strike at the very heart of the Fatimid Caliphate. His army crossed the Sinai Desert and invaded Egypt. The Franks captured the coastal city of Ramla with little difficulty. The path to Cairo, the capital of the Caliphate, seemed open. Egypt was gripped by panic. It was here at the peak of triumph that the scene with which we began our story occurred. Baldwin, feasting on the banks of the Nile, fell ill. The illness was most likely caused by food poisoning from that same Nile fish, which exacerbated the effects of an old wound leading to internal bleeding or peritonitis. The king's condition deteriorated rapidly. It became clear that he was dying. His knights, realizing the campaign was doomed, turned back, carrying their dying king on a litter. Baldwin remained conscious and gave orders to the last. He understood that his death far from Jerusalem could once again plunge the kingdom into the chaos of a power struggle. He made his barons swear an oath that they would support as his successor either his elder brother Eustace III, Count of Bouillon, if he agreed to come from Europe, or if Eustace refused, his loyal cousin and comrade-in-arms, Baldwin of Bourg, Count of Edessa. On April 2, 1118, in the small desert fortress of Al-Arish on the border of Egypt and Palestine, the heart of Baldwin I stopped. Before his death, he gave his last order, which perfectly characterizes his pragmatic nature. He ordered his cook, named Arda, to remove his entrails and bury them in Al-Arish, and to rub the body itself with salt and spices to preserve it from decomposition on the long journey to Jerusalem. He wanted to be buried in the Holy City, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, next to his brother Godfrey. His will was carried out. The funeral procession moved slowly through the entire kingdom. Weeping and sorrow accompanied it. The Frankish knights wept, having lost their king and commander. The Syrian Christians wept, having lost their protector. When the procession reached Jerusalem, his body was buried with honors in the main shrine of the Christian world. The inscription on his tomb read, "Here lies Baldwin, a second Judas Maccabeus, the hope of the fatherland, the strength of the church, the valor of both. Egypt and Dan and bloody Damascus feared him and brought him tribute." What is the legacy of this man? It is immense and contradictory. On the one hand, Baldwin I was the true founder of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. If Godfrey was its idealistic harbinger, Baldwin was its real architect. He was a brilliant military commander who lost almost no battle he entered of his own will. He was a wise and far-sighted politician who managed to create a strong state from nothing in a short time. He was a subtle diplomat, skilled at playing on the contradictions of his enemies. He laid the foundations of the kingdom's legislation, administration, and economy, which lasted for almost 2 centuries. Without his energy, will, and pragmatism, the Latin kingdom would most likely not have survived its first, most difficult years. On the other hand, he cannot be called a model of a Christian knight. He was immensely ambitious, cunning, at times cruel, and completely unscrupulous when it came to achieving his goals. The betrayal of his adoptive father Thoros, the exile of 2 wives, the breaking of his oath to Adelaide of Sicily. All this paints a picture of a man for whom power was the highest value. He was not a saint. He was an empire builder with all the vices inherent in that trade. Historians assess him differently. Stephen Runciman, a classic historian of the Crusades, saw him as a brilliant adventurer whose ambition saved the Crusader cause. Modern researchers such as Christopher Tyerman or Thomas Asbridge emphasize his outstanding abilities as a statesman who created a unique symbiosis of Western and Eastern elements in governance. But they all agree on one thing. Baldwin I was one of the most significant and brilliant figures of the Crusader era. He was a self-made man, a younger son who was not destined to own an acre of land, by the force of his mind, will, and sword, carved out a kingdom for himself at the edge of the world and inscribed his name in the annals of history. His life is an epic saga of power, ambition, faith, and betrayal, played out against the backdrop of one of the most dramatic and fateful periods in human history. Having finished his earthly journey in the sands on the border of Egypt, Baldwin I left behind a creation that was both strong and fragile. Strong because it had clear borders, a powerful army, a functioning administration, and a viable economy. Fragile because it was surrounded by a sea of enemies, and its internal stability depended on the personality of the monarch and the agreement among the barons. His successor, as he had willed, was his cousin Baldwin of Bouillon, crowned as Baldwin II. He proved to be a worthy heir, continuing his predecessor's work of strengthening the kingdom. But the seeds of future problems sown under the first king were already beginning to sprout. The resentment of the kingdom of Sicily for the humiliation of Adelaide del Vasto would haunt the Latin East more than once. The example of Baldwin himself, who created his own principality in Edessa, would inspire other barons to separatism and the pursuit of personal interest to the detriment of the common cause. It was at this time, in response to the pressing problems left by Baldwin I, that one of the most famous phenomena of the era was born. The king had secured the borders, but the roads within the kingdom, especially the route from the port of Jaffa to Jerusalem, which was infested with robbers, remained mortally dangerous for unarmed pilgrims. And so in 1119 or 1120, a French knight named Hugh de Payens and 8 of his companions took vows before the Patriarch of Jerusalem, swearing to protect pilgrims. King Baldwin II granted them part of his palace, located on the site of the destroyed Temple of Solomon, for their headquarters. Thus appeared the poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar. The birth of the military monastic orders was a direct consequence and continuation of the work of Baldwin I. He had built the state, and the orders became a new, unprecedented tool for its defense. The very structure of the state he created carried a contradiction. It was a Western feudal kingdom transplanted onto foreign soil. It depended on a constant flow of people and resources from Europe, which over time began to dwindle. It ruled over a majority population that was alien to it in faith and culture. This fragility would become fully apparent in just a few decades. In 1144, Edessa would fall, the very county where Baldwin's story as a ruler began. This event would be the cause of the Second Crusade, and in 1187, less than 70 years after the death of Baldwin I, the great Saladin would crush the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin and return Jerusalem to Muslim rule. But even after this catastrophic defeat, the kingdom created by Baldwin would not disappear. It would be reborn in a truncated form with its capital at Acre, and would survive for another 100 years, and all this time it would live by the laws and traditions laid down by its first great king. Baldwin I is a figure of Shakespearean stature. He embodied the spirit of his age, an age of great achievements and great sins. He was a man who looked at the world not with the eyes of a fanatic, but with the eyes of a builder. His Jerusalem was not only the heavenly city of prophecies, but also the capital of a real earthly kingdom that needed to be defended, strengthened, and expanded. And in this earthly task, he succeeded as no other. His story is not just a chapter from a textbook. It is an eternal reminder of what a person driven by unbending will and boundless ambition is capable of. At the crossroads of civilizations where empires, religions, and destinies collide, his shadow will long hover over the Holy Land, the shadow of a king born without a kingdom, but who conquered the most important one of all. Thank you for your attention. If this story seemed interesting to you and you wish to continue delving into the most captivating and dramatic pages of the past, please subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, and share this video. Many more amazing journeys through time await us.